The private dining room at Auberge Sainte-Claire in Old Montreal had a particular kind of silence that money could buy, the kind where the linen was thick enough to muffle the sound of cutlery, where the chandelier light was warm enough to soften every hard edge, and where the staff were trained so thoroughly in invisibility that most guests forgot they were ever there at all. Marisol Vega had been invisible in that room for 3 years. She was good at it, exceptional, even. The general manager, a tightly wound man named Clifton Barbeau, had told her once, not as a compliment, exactly, more as an observation, that she moved through a room like water around stone. She had thanked him and gone back to resetting a table. What she didn't say was that she'd learned to move that way out of necessity, because girls who grew up watching their mothers navigate hospital waiting rooms at 2 in the morning learned early that the less space you took up, the safer you were. That night, in late October, the room had been booked under the name Drummond Capital, which told her almost nothing except that whoever had made the reservation had money and wanted privacy. The booking was for 7. 2 would be from the Canadian side. She found that out from Barbeau when he briefed the floor staff that afternoon, and the 3rd was flying in from Seoul. "Cop dinner," Barbeau said, as if that explained everything. The usual. Impeccable service. No interruptions, no hovering. You pour, you clear, you disappear. Marisol nodded. She was already disappearing. She had not always been a waitress. This was the thing that people who knew her before, professors at McGill, classmates from the economics faculty, the graduate school advisor who had written her the letter she never ended up using, would have found quietly devastating to witness. Marisol Vega, at 22, had been the kind of student that other students resented because she made everything look effortless, and she resented them back because nothing was effortless, not for her, not ever. She had grown up in the Plateau Montreal, on the ground floor of a triplex that smelled like her mother's cooking, and the slow, persistent leak under the bathroom sink that the landlord never fixed. Her father had left when she was 11. Her mother, Consuelo, cleaned offices downtown 5 nights a week and never once complained about it, which Marisol found both admirable and quietly heartbreaking. She had gotten the scholarship to McGill on her own. She had finished her undergraduate degree in 3.5 years, double majoring in economics and East Asian studies, because she had a gift for languages that had revealed itself almost by accident at 16, when her neighbor, an elderly Korean woman named Mrs. Bae, had started teaching her Hangul in exchange for help with English paperwork. By 21, she could read Korean newspapers without difficulty. By 22, she was enrolled in a joint program and had been offered a research assistant position in international trade economics that came with a modest stipend and the very real possibility of a future that looked nothing like the one she'd inherited. Then Consuelo's diagnosis came back. Stage 3, treatable, the oncologist said, with that careful optimism doctors learned to deploy like a tool. Hopeful enough to keep you going, measured enough to protect them if it didn't. Treatable meant surgeries, and surgeries meant time off work, and time off work meant the ground floor of the Plateau triplex could not sustain itself without someone holding it up. Marisol withdrew from the graduate program in February. She told her advisor it was temporary. She had believed it when she said it. That was 4 years ago. She was 29 now, and she poured water at Auberge Sainte-Claire, and she was very, very good at it. The Drummond Capital party arrived 12 minutes late, which was not unusual for people who believed the world would wait for them. The first through the door was a man Marisol would come to know as Preston Drummond, late 40s, silver hair swept back from a broad forehead, the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, and now had simply become authoritative. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Marisol made in a month, and he had the habit, she noticed immediately, of entering a room like he was expecting applause. Behind him came a younger man, early 30s, introduced to the table briefly as his associate, Callum Bryce, sharper-looking, leaner, with quick eyes that catalogued the room in a single pass. He reminded Marisol of a particular type she had encountered in her economics classes, the student who understood everything except why understanding wasn't the same as wisdom. The third person came last. She was a woman perhaps 60 years old, small and impeccably composed in a steel-grey dress that managed to be both understated and quietly devastating. Her name, Marisol had learned from the reservation notes, was Soo-Jin Kwak. She was, according to the brief Barbeau had distributed, the founder and executive chair of Kwak Industries, a South Korean conglomerate with significant interests in sustainable infrastructure, battery technology, and more recently Canadian green energy. She was also, it became clear within the first 90 seconds of the dinner, entirely silent. Not shy, not uncomfortable, silent in the way that people are silent when they have decided, for reasons of their own, to listen before they speak. She sat at the corner of the rectangular table, her hands folded in her lap, her expression pleasant and completely unreadable, and she let Preston Drummond talk. He talked a great deal. Marisol moved through the early courses with the practiced economy of someone who had done this enough times that her body carried the muscle memory even when her mind was elsewhere. She poured the Riesling. She cleared the amuse-bouches. She brought the first course, a sunchoke velouté with a few curls of crispy prosciutto, and set each bowl down without a sound. She was not supposed to listen, or rather, she was not supposed to appear to listen, which was a more complicated instruction. The room was not large, sound carried, and Preston Drummond was not a quiet man. The projections are conservative, he was saying to Bryce, as though Soo-Jin were not at the table. We built in a 20% buffer on the low end, but realistically, with the federal incentives and the Quebec climate credits, we're looking at a 17 to 23% return over 7 years. That's a number that holds up. Bryce nodded, in the practiced way of someone who knew his job was to echo, not to add. Soo-Jin said nothing. A translator had been arranged, Barbeau had mentioned. Someone from a language services firm, booked for the evening. Except when Marisol had come in to set the room at 5 o'clock, Barbeau had been on the phone in the hallway, his voice low and tight, and afterward he had straightened his jacket and told her, tersely, that there had been a cancellation. The translation firm had sent a regret. The individual they'd booked had a family emergency. "Are we finding someone else?" Marisol had asked. Barbeau had looked at her with the mild exasperation of a man who had too many problems and not enough patience. "Mr. Drummond has been informed. He's handling it." It appeared, watching the dinner unfold, that Mr. Drummond's way of handling it was to speak more slowly and more loudly, as though volume were a reasonable substitute for comprehension. He had, at some point in the cocktail hour before they sat down, pulled up something on his phone, a translation app, and now he was passing it across the table periodically, holding it towards Soo-Jin like it was a communion wafer. She accepted it each time with a small, gracious nod. She read what it said. She smiled faintly. She passed it back. She had not, Marisol observed, agreed to anything. The tension arrived quietly, the way it usually did in rooms like this, not as a confrontation but as a texture, a change in the air. It happened around the main course, when Bryce produced a folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table beside the rack of lamb. "We thought, given the timeline," he said, "it might make sense to look at the terms this evening." Initial review. Nothing binding, obviously. just so we're aligned before the formal signing on Friday." He slid the folder across the table toward Sujin. She opened it. She read it with the same stillness she'd brought to everything that evening, turning pages with deliberate care, and Marisol, refilling the water glasses on her second pass of the table, noticed that Sujin had paused on the third page for slightly longer than the others. Preston Drummond leaned back in his chair and picked up his wineglass. He looked satisfied in the way that men look satisfied when they believe the conclusion has already been reached, and the remaining steps are formality. He murmured something to Bryce about the flight back to Toronto on Thursday, about whether the hotel could arrange a late checkout, about whether Bryce had confirmed the reservations for the club afterward. He spoke as though Sujin could not understand him. It was this, precisely this, the particular carelessness of assuming someone could not hear you, that made Marisol stop beside the service station near the east wall and stand very still, because she had been watching Sujin's face. And in the moment that Drummond mentioned Thursday's flight, "We'll have her signature. By Wednesday we won't need to stay for the full week," something had passed across Sujin's expression. Not surprise. Something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. The small, contained acknowledgement of a thing confirmed. Marisol stood at the service station and did not move. She looked at the folder. She thought about the third page and the way Sujin's hand had paused there. She thought about what she knew about green energy contracts from the 2 years of international trade economics she had completed before Consuelo's diagnosis had pulled her off that track. She thought about the kind of clause that would make a careful woman pause on page 3. She thought about what it would cost her to say something. She poured the water. She disappeared back into the corridor. It was during the cheese course that Marisol made her decision. She would not have been able to explain it fully afterward in language that captured the whole shape of it. Part of it was the conversation she'd overheard. Not just the Thursday comment, but an earlier exchange between Drummond and Bryce when they'd first been seated, before Sujin arrived when they'd thought they were alone. She doesn't have anyone here. No counsel, no support staff. She wanted to handle this personally, which works in our favor. Part of it was 4 years of watching wealthy men treat service staff like fixtures, and the particular exhaustion that came from being expected to witness things without reacting. Part of it was Consuelo, who had spent 30 years cleaning up after people who did not notice her, and who had taught Marisol, by example rather than instruction, that invisibility was a choice you made, not a condition you were born into. And part of it, she would be honest about this, at least to herself, was the third page of that folder, because she had caught a glimpse of it when she'd been clearing the bread plates, and she had good eyes, and she could read Korean, and what she had seen in that brief moment was a clause that did not match what Preston Drummond had been describing all evening. Not even close. She went to the kitchen. She asked the junior server, a young man named Felix, who was 19 and mostly thought about hockey, to handle the water refills for 5 minutes. She stood at the counter and thought about whether she was about to make the worst mistake of her professional life. Then she went back into the dining room. She approached the table from Sujin's side, which was a deliberate choice. She bent slightly, the way she'd been trained to do when speaking quietly to a seated guest, and she said, in Korean, in a voice low enough that it did not carry past the immediate radius of the table, "Excuse me, I apologize for the interruption. I noticed you paused on the third page of that document. If I'm mistaken about what I saw there, I'm sorry. Please ignore me. But if I'm not mistaken, the revenue sharing clause in Section 4 is written quite differently in the Korean translation than what's been described verbally this evening. The table went completely still. She could feel Preston Drummond staring at her. She kept her eyes on Su Jin. For a long moment, the older woman said nothing. Her expression did not change. She looked at Marisol with a steadiness that was neither warm nor cold, simply attentive, in the way of someone who is deciding whether something is what it appears to be. Then she said, in Korean, quietly, "Tell me what you saw." Marisol told her. Preston Drummond's response was immediate and not particularly dignified. "What is happening?" he said at first to Bryce, then directly to Marisol, then somewhere into the general air of the room, as though the room itself might answer. "Who is? What is she saying? What are they saying?" He turned to Bryce. "She's a waitress." "Why is she speaking to our guest in, what is that, Japanese?" "Is that Japanese?" "Korean," Marisol said, in English, because she saw no reason to pretend she hadn't heard him. The look on his face shifted from confusion to something harder. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is a private business dinner, and you are staff, and I would like you to leave this table immediately." Preston. It was the first time Su Jin had spoken in English. Her voice was accented but clear, and carried the particular authority of someone who had spent decades being underestimated in boardrooms and had long since stopped concerning herself with it. Drummond blinked. "She will stay," Su Jin said. She looked at Marisol. "Please continue." Marisol continued. She was aware, in some detached part of her mind, that her hands were steady, even though her heart was doing something unpleasant and irregular behind her sternum. She explained, in Korean, the specific discrepancy she had noticed, a clause in Section 4 of the agreement that restructured the revenue-sharing arrangement in a way that would, in years 5 through 7 of the contract, redirect a significant percentage of returns through a subsidiary entity that had not been named or described in the verbal presentation. The effect, compounded against the depreciation schedule in the appendix, was that the actual return to Quack Industries over the 7-year period would be substantially lower than the figures Drummond had quoted. The difference was not trivial. Su Jin listened without interrupting. When Marisol finished, she turned back to the document and reread the 3rd page, this time with the focus of someone who knows exactly what she's looking for. The silence at the table was the kind that had weight. Drummond attempted to fill it. He said something about complexity, about tiered structures being standard practice, about how any contract attorney would confirm the arrangement was within industry norms. His voice had lost some of its ease. Bryce said nothing. Bryce had the look of a man who was rapidly calculating distances between here and the door, between this evening and whatever came after it. Su Jin set the document down. She said, in English, deliberately, Marisol understood, so there would be no question of what she had communicated. "I will not be signing this." Drummond's face went through several things in quick succession. "Su Jin, Miss Quack, I think there may be a misunderstanding here if someone has been whispering things in your ear that—" "She did not whisper," Su Jin said. "She read," she explained. She was correct. A pause. "I had already noticed the clause. I was waiting to see whether you would explain it." Another silence. Bryce looked at his hands. "You were testing us," Drummond said. It came out flatter than he had intended. "I was gathering information," Su Jin said, with the mild patience of someone explaining a simple thing to a slow student. "It is what I do before I make decisions." I would have thought that was clear. Barbo appeared at the edge of the dining room doorway, drawn by some instinct or by Felix's nervous face. Marisol wasn't sure which. He looked at the table. He looked at Marisol. His expression passed through several things before settling on the particular blankness of a manager deciding which crisis to address first. Marisol looked back at him steadily. Whatever happened next, she had done what she'd done, and she found that she was not sorry about it. What happened, as it turned out, was this: Sujin requested pen and paper. She wrote a number on it, a hotel name, a meeting time for the following morning, and passed it to Drummond with the formal courtesy of someone concluding a meeting that had already concluded. She thanked him for the dinner. She thanked Auberge St. Clair in general terms for its hospitality. She stood, smoothed her dress, and turned to Marisol. "Will you walk with me to the entrance?" she asked, in Korean. Marisol looked at Barbeau. Barbeau, after a moment, gave a small, tight nod. They walked together through the dining room, past the other tables with their quiet conversations and their warm light, out through the heavy glass doors and into the October air of old Montreal, where the cobblestones were damp from an evening drizzle and the street lamps were haloed in mist. On the steps of Auberge St. Clair, Sujin stopped. She studied Marisol for a moment, with the same attentive stillness she'd brought to everything that evening. Then she said, "You speak Korean very well. How?" Marisol told her about Mrs. Bay, about the Hangul lessons in exchange for English paperwork, about the graduate program at McGill, about East Asian studies and international trade economics, about how she had been 22 and on a path that had led somewhere and then had led somewhere else entirely. She did not say it as a complaint. She said it the way you report a fact, accurately, without decoration. Sujin listened. When Marisol finished, she asked, "And your mother? Is she well now?" Marisol paused. "She finished treatment 18 months ago. She's working again. Part-time." "Good," Sujin said simply. "Then, the clause you identified this evening would have cost my company approximately $11 million over the contract period. I noticed it, as I said, but I did not know at that point whether it was intentional or an error. The way those men spoke when they believed I could not understand them." She paused. "That clarified things." "It would," Marisol said. "You risked your employment to tell me. I know why." It was a direct question offered without drama, and Marisol answered it the same way. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I've spent 4 years being the person in the room that no one thinks is paying attention, and I was tired of it." Sujin was quiet for a moment. The mist moved through the haloed street lamps above them. "I am in Montreal until Thursday," she said finally. "My Canadian operations team has been without a bilingual trade liaison for several months. We've been managing with external contractors, which is inefficient." She paused. "I don't typically make offers on restaurant steps." "I wouldn't either," Marisol said. The corner of Sujin's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. The position would require Korean and English, obviously. French would be an asset. A background in trade economics would be necessary. International travel would be involved. Marisol looked out at the wet cobblestones of old Montreal and thought about the ground floor of the Plateau triplex and the scholarship she had earned on her own, and the graduate school letter she had never used, and the 4 years of invisibility in a room built to make her invisible. She thought about Consuelo, who had spent 30 years moving through spaces that didn't notice her, and who had told her once, matter-of-factly, on a night when they were both very tired, "The world does not hand you the door, Marisol. You find it yourself." "I have a degree in economics and East Asian studies," she said. "I speak English, French, Spanish, and Korean. I've spent 4 years studying how high-net-worth individuals make decisions under pressure." She looked at Sujin. "I'm available." She went back inside to finish her shift. This was the part that people, later, would find either very sensible or very funny depending on their temperament. She cleared the cheese plates. She brought the dessert menus. She poured coffee for a couple at table 9 who were celebrating something and kept laughing at each other's jokes. She reset the private dining room after the Drummond Capital Party left. Bryce first, quickly and without meeting her eyes. Drummond last, who paused near the door and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, not quite anger, not quite admiration. Something that people who'd never been held accountable for anything wore when they first made its acquaintance. She folded the linen. She set the silver back in its proper places. Barbeau caught her near the service station at the end of the night, when the dining room was quiet and the other staff were pulling on their coats. He stood there for a moment looking at her, then looked away, then said precisely, "I'll need some notice for the schedule." 2 weeks, she said. "I'll give you 2 weeks." He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, then thought better of it. She got her coat. She walked out through the back entrance, past the alley where the kitchen staff took their breaks, out onto the street where the October night was cold and clear and the mist had lifted while she wasn't looking. The city was quiet in the way that Montreal gets quiet late on a weeknight, not empty, just resting, saving something for later. She stood there for a moment. 4 years of being the water that moved around the stone, and it had turned out the stone wasn't immovable after all. It had turned out the stone was just waiting for someone to finally push. She pulled out her phone and called Consuelo. Her mother answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep, and said, "Marisol, what time is it?" "Late," she said. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to tell you something." "Tell me in the morning," Consuelo said, not unkindly. "I will," she said, "but I wanted you to know tonight that things are going to be different now." A pause on the line. Then her mother, who had spent 30 years cleaning offices, and who had taught her daughter, by example and without ever once saying so, that the world was navigable if you were patient, and paid attention and refused to stop, her mother said, simply, "Good," and Marisol walked home through the lights of the city, which were bright and various and entirely hers.